try and give some context for the English Revolution, and then talk a little bit about who the levelers were and what they did in the English Revolution. So there's a kind of 20-year period which really comprises the English Revolution, from the calling of the Long Parliament by Charles I in 1640 through 1649, which is the end of the civil wars, at least in England, and the execution of the king and the declaration of a republic, and the abolition of the House of Lords, through to the death of Cromwell in 1659 and the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II returns to the throne, and the Stuart dynasty continues. This period in English history is called the interregnum, which literally means the kind of interruption, which is how they look on it. But I'll try and explain why it's a bit more significant than an interruption in the natural flow of kings and queens. So that's the kind of timeline of events. Talk a little bit about the forces within it, because like every revolution, and part of the significance of the English Revolution is the first modern revolutionary moment. It is recognisably the forerunner of the American Revolution of 1776, of the French Revolution of 1789. It is part of the pattern by which Europe leaves the feudal era and becomes a recognisably capitalist social entity, and where the ideas of parliamentary representation rather than aristocratic kinghood are the forms of government, at least aspired to, if not necessarily realised. And like all the subsequent revolutions, there's a particular pattern of development within the English Revolution, and it goes like this really: that at the outbreak of the revolution there is a huge kind of social bloc opposed to the existing government, and it runs right across the society. It spans oppositional groups, it spans social classes, it leaves really the existing government, in this case the government of Charles I, enormously socially isolated. So when the Long Parliament is called and the opposition to the king crystallises in the Long Parliament, practically every section, these are property people, these aren't, you know, there is no electoral process here. These are essentially a gathering of the county rich, represented, the burgesses represented in Parliament, the knights of the shires in the House of Lords, the large landowning aristocrats. Right across this spectrum there is opposition to Charles I, from very rich merchants, very considerable landed aristocrats, right the way down to yeoman farmers and masters and apprentices in the towns. There is opposition, not universal. The king has support, has a social base within the society, as you would expect, but a very broad opposition to Charles I. But and this is what's characteristic of all revolutions, actually. As the revolution progresses, there becomes a social, political, and class differentiation within the revolutionary camp. What at one stage of the revolution is a sufficiency of change for some groups who think the revolution has now gone far enough, ought to stop, this is enough social change, is for others only the beginning of the process. And the significant phases of that process of differentiation within the revolutionary camp, I would say, are these. As I say, there's a very, very broad front of opposition to Charles I, as the Long Parliament is called in 1640. By the time 1642 comes, it's clear that the battle in Parliament is not going to be the end of the matter. it's clear that there is going to be an armed clash, that there is going to be a civil war. And at this point, some people who were opposed to the king in Parliament say, hang on, if this is going to result in a civil war, this has gone too far already. Although we were part of a parliamentary opposition, actually, when it comes to the king raising his standards, issuing the call for people to rally to the royal standard, raises it in Nottingham, then we're with the king. So they depart from the parliamentary camp into the royalist camp. That's in 1642. As the civil war takes place, there's a process of radicalisation within the parliamentary camp. And there are some people, the Earls of Manchester and Essex, who are the leaders of the parliamentary army, who say, look, the business of going to war with the king is to force him back from the negotiating table. It's not about destroying the king's army, it's not about abolishing monarchy, it's not about fundamental social change, it's simply about forcing the king back into a negotiating situation. In fact, the parliamentary armies bizarrely went to war with the king under the slogan for king and parliament. And they wanted, this is what they wanted the king to be at least responsible to, or to a certain extent held to account by parliamentary government. What they didn't want, what they weren't thinking about, was a republic. They certainly weren't thinking about chopping off the king's head, and this is as late as 1643, 1640, 1644. And therefore the parliamentary camp, and this of course has a direct effect on the military tactics. If you think the business that we're at war for is to bring the king back to the negotiating table, you aren't really in the business of destroying the king's army on the battlefield, because that would not lead to that outcome. So the parliamentary camp divides into a compromise camp, which is normally known by the essentially religious term, the Presbyterians. They were politically moderate. I'll come on to why it's linked to a religious term in a moment. And the Independents, which is also a political and religious term. And we can sort of broadly say that this is a kind of compromise, war and compromise party, the Presbyterians, and a win the war party. And the win the war party, the Independents, are led by Oliver Cromwell, and the Levellers emerge as part of the win the war wing of the parliamentary side. There's a kind of settling of accounts when Parliament forms the new model army under the command of Sir Thomas Fairfax. Lieutenant General Cromwell is technically the second in command of cavalry, but effectively the political leader of the new model army. And the compromisers are, for a period, pushed to the sidelines. The Win the War party take control of the parliamentary armies and smash the king up. At Marston Moor, at Naseby in 1645, the king's armies are decisively smashed up by the new model army. So the first civil war is over. The king has been defeated. Then there's another process of differentiation that takes place. What is the settlement of the nation going to be? The king has been broken on the battlefield, but as so often happens after a military victory, it's not clear what the settlement will be. So the compromise with the King party makes a reappearance. It says, we need a treaty with the king. We need the king to be brought back to London, to be re-enthroned, and for there to be a new settlement based on a new compromise. And this argument goes on from 1645 right the way through to 1649, when ultimately the king is executed. And there are attempts by the Presbyterian moderates to retake leadership of the parliamentary side, to disband the new model army, to send it to Ireland, to get it out of the way, to marginalise the Independents, to defeat Cromwell, to bring the king back. The leadership of the Independents, Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Ireton, are vacillating between these two positions. Should they have a treaty with the king? Shouldn't they have a treaty with the king? And the king knows that this is the issue. He says, Charles I says at one point that his aim at this point, he tells Lord Digby, one of his members of the Royal Council, I do not despair of inducing the Presbyterians or the Independents to join me in exterminating the other, and then I shall be king again. So there's this three-cornered fight. The Presbyterians, the moderates, the Independents, and their Leather allies on the far left of the revolution, and the king attempted to play both ends against the middle to return to power. The religious question is critical here because it's the motivating factor for lots of people in fighting. The Reformation in this country established the Church of England, the break from Rome, break from Catholicism. Think about it now. Is that the state, is that the church in the 17th century is the equivalent social institution of the entirety of the education system, a very large part of the media in modern society. That's what it does. So church attendance is compulsory. If you do not attend church on a Sunday and listen to the sermon, you can be fined and imprisoned. The ministers are paid for by tithes. 10% of the income is a taxation which goes directly to the church for the maintenance of the preacher. So it's an ideological question, but it's directly a question of political power as well. And the Stuart monarchs, James I, the father of Charles I, are very intent on having a hierarchical, semi-Catholic, in terms of ritual, church. James I says at a conference to discuss what kind of church there will be in England, says in 1606, I think, no bishops, no king. In other words, if you take away the hierarchy of the church, this will lead to the destruction of the political hierarchy in society as well. So it's an intensely political question. The Presbyterians were in favour of, even though they were in conflict with the king, were in favour of a hierarchical national church of which everybody was a member. The Independents were in favour of independent churches, and the left of the Independents, including the Levellers, were in favour of what they called gathered churches. That is, it was a voluntary association of believers, that there was very little church hierarchy, there was very little ritual, there was very this is the tradition that ends in Methodism, and at that time actually produced the Quakers at the end of this period. So very simple. There is a direct relationship between the individual worshipper and God, which is not mediated by the clergy. There's a very democratic setup. There are no tithes. If there are to be paid preachers, they will be paid by voluntary contribution by the congregation. Now, this is a devastatingly bad idea if you're a monarch. It's a devastatingly bad idea to get rid of the church hierarchy. It's a devastatingly bad idea to allow people to decide who their preacher will be. It's a devastatingly bad idea to allow that, as they put it, every tinker and every door sweeping tinker can preach. This was a very, very bad idea, and there's an obsession in the 17th century with what are called hedge preachers, or mechanic preachers, i.e., people who believed they had the Spirit of God and would testify to this. Just ordinary people. It's a very bad idea. Okay, the Levellers are at the heart of all this, so let me talk a little bit about them. They are on the radical wing from the very beginning. They are on the radical wing of all this. Let me just talk about this man. This man is John Lilburne, known as Honest John Lilburne, freeborn John Lilburne. And from the beginning, before the Civil War, in 1638, he is a man who is importing into England, completely illegally, from the Dutch Protestant Republic, radical Puritan tracts. Bad news is, he gets caught. And he gets caught and hauled before the Court of Star Chamber. This is a court held in Westminster. It's called the Star Chamber because there's a painted ceiling with lots of stars on it. It is the enforcing court for illegal publications. All publication had to be sanctioned by the state. You couldn't just go and print anything you liked. There was no freedom of the press whatsoever. Importing books was illegal if it hadn't been licensed by the Crown. And John Lilburne was breaking the law. He was dragged into prison. He was sentenced, and his sentence was that he would be whipped, tied to the back of a cart, and whipped from Fleet Street, from the Fleet Prison, which is where Fleet Street now is, to Old Palace Yard in Westminster. And that's what happened to him. He was whipped all the way, and huge crowds turned out to support him. He was put in the pillory, and while he was still in the pillory, he was reaching into his coat. I mean, he's been whipped. They reckon that he had 500 strokes of to Westminster. He was put in the pillory, and while he was doing the pillory, he was reaching into his coat pocket and throwing pamphlets to the crowd. He was still making political speeches, so they had to gag him while he was in the pillory. So he becomes famous. And his defence was that he was a freeborn Englishman with the rights of a freeborn Englishman. And from that moment on, he's famous. He's famous for this. This is an engraving of him from the front of a pamphlet which he wrote about this. He explained what had happened to him. It was called The Christian Man's Trial, the pamphlet. And it was issued in 1641, I believe, just after he was freed. And it was printed illegally by a man called William Larner. And William Larner would become the printer, or one of the printers, of the Leveller movement. So from a very early point, this is before even the first splits in the parliamentary camp, you begin to see the Leveller movement not identified as such, not yet an organisation, but beginning to make connections. Here's another one. This is the same picture. As you can see, it's exactly the same picture. But it's from a later pamphlet, 1646. And you can see now the titles in it. The liberty of the freeborn Englishman conferred on him by the House of Lords, June 1646. This is when the House of Lords eventually gets around to agreeing that he was illegally imprisoned by the Star Chamber and awarding him reparations. Now, this is interesting. This is a very interesting picture because it's produced by a man called Richard Overton. And Richard Overton was the one of the key leaders and pamphleteers of the Leveller movement, and he was running an underground press in London from the very, very earliest days of the revolution. And this is, you know, we're now familiar with photo montage and with Photoshop and so forth and so on. Well, I guess this is engraver montage, because what Overton has done is to engrave the prison bars over the top of the original portrait of Lilburn from the Christian Man's trial. And this is about another period of imprisonment. Lilburn was in and out. I think there were only 2 years in the entire decade of the English Revolution when John Lilburn wasn't in prison for at least some of the year, and quite often for very long periods as well. So this is an example of the Leveller movement now beginning to come together, beginning to self-identify as a collective group of people, beginning to organise, because to print illegally, to distribute illegally, to organise protests at the gates of Parliament, this is all a question now of political organisation, absolutely uniquely. I mean, to imagine, just to get your head into how unique this kind of political organisation was, which we now take absolutely for granted, the word party wasn't even in existence in the 17th century. It simply meant the same as we might think about using the word group, or perhaps at the extreme of a faction of people. A party to an argument is maybe the modern use of it. The idea of a political party was absolutely new, and these people were beginning to form one. They were cooperating on the production of pamphlets. They were producing mass petitions. The first organised group of people to mass petition. Petitioning was a very old and archaic form of address in the 17th century. Running back into the Middle Ages, was the way in which you petitioned for the rectification of a grievance to an authority. That was understood. But the idea that you took a petition to a mass population and got them to sign up to it, that was absolutely out of order. People said, I mean, when the Long Parliament did it themselves, one of their members, Sir Edward Deering, said, if I had thought that we were going to remonstrate downwards to the people and talk of the king as if he were a third person, I would never have agreed to this. So this is an absolutely radical departure, and Lilburn and Overton and William Larner are now all working very closely together in this business. So is this man, William Walwyn. William Walwyn is a silk merchant. He lives just outside London City Walls in Moorfields, and he's organising in the Salters' Hall. London at this time has got the Guild, the Leathermakers' Hall, the Salters' Hall, the Mercers' Hall, are guild institutions all over the old city of London. And at the Salters' Hall, right in the heart of the city of London, is where the militia committee, the organising heart, the financing heart, the arming heart of the parliamentary armies is taking place, and William Walwyn is working there amongst the independents, amongst the supporters of Cromwell and so forth and so on. And he makes contact with, actually Lilburn is dishing out pamphlets outside the Palace of Westminster, and he comes in contact with Walwyn, who's going down there to petition himself, and they begin to cooperate. And William Walwyn brings his supporters, the independents, down to a meeting at the Nag's Head Tavern, and they kind of fuse for a period as a radical group with the they aren't called levellers yet, but with the people who are organising around John Lilburn and his allies. Henry Martin is an MP who supports the levellers, is in very close contact with them. He's one of the very few people who, even before the English Revolution, even before the meeting of the Long Parliament, is a theoretical Republican. He says no single man is wise enough to govern us all. He's an opponent of kingship from very, very early stages, fantastically radical period. He's the only person actually who has the distinction of being called a whoremaster by both Charles I and Oliver Cromwell. And the reason is absolutely astounding. He was, as aristocratic marriages were, he was married to the daughter of a local landowner in his home county of Berkshire. He didn't get on with her, so he went to live with a woman called Mary Ward, who lived with, as much later generation would say, in sin. When they were at the height of their power, they had, as the revolution progressed, they had apartments in Westminster. She would attend the balls with Henry Martin, was known as Mrs. Henry Martin. Now this is complete, you think Martin's love letters to Mary Ward, printed them as an attempt to discredit him. They're such kind letters that even in the Restoration it backfired, and Martin's reputation grew as a response to it. Now, this is the portrait, you should go and see it. This is the portrait of Henry Martin in the National Gallery. Now, you can't quite see it, I think, very clearly, but on the portrait, if you get close enough, you can see here. Just here is the word now. Now, this is very unusual. Why is that? This is it's a sitting portrait. Why is the word now here? That's because Henry Martin was the teller in the House of Commons on a division about whether or not they should proceed against the king then or later. And the amendment said now. So that's why the word now is in the portrait of Henry Martin. He was actually, without doubt, the funniest man in the English Revolution, the greatest wit of the English Revolution. There was a motion in the House of Commons at one point that the nodders should be put out. That is, that the MPs that fell asleep during debate should be kicked out of the chamber, which, is a pretty good amendment. Henry Martin amended that motion to say that the noddies, i.e. the bores that put them to sleep, should be kicked out. When it came to declaring the Republic in 1649, the motion in the Commons to abolish the House of Lords read that the House of Lords should be abolished because it was useless and dangerous. Henry Martin moved an amendment that said it was useless but not dangerous. He famously said of John Lilburn, because Lilburn was a fantastic, disputatious, aggressive character many times. And Martin said, if there were only John Lilburn left in the world, John would argue with Lilburn, and Lilburn would argue with John. So it's a pleasure to read Henry Martin. If you get the chance, you should. This is John Wildman, later Sir John Wildman, later in the Restoration. Amazingly, how he survived. Really, you read the biography, you just can't understand it. He became Postmaster General. He's responsible for the post office in this country in many ways. One of the leaders of the levellers in the Putney debates with Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, arguing for this document, the Agreement of the People. The Agreement of the People, well, just the title is an astounding thing in the 17th century. This is about how the government of the country should be settled after the revolution. And the levellers' idea was that the Agreement of the People, which would call for annual parliaments, which we still haven't got, which would extend the franchise. It's debatable about how far they intended to extend the franchise, but massively beyond the property classes that had it at the time. Demanded freedom of press, demanded freedom of religious worship, things that by and large, we still don't have. This was the argument put by the Levellers in the period after the First Civil War had ended about how the nation should be settled. And it proposed these freedoms, and it proposed to establish them as, if you like, the constitution of the country by mass petition, by people signing their names to, agreeing that this would be the form of government. So it's a fantastically modern democratic idea to be suddenly erupting at a time when the Middle Ages are barely over. And there was a debate. The New Model Army camped outside, just on the edges of London at Putney, and there are things recorded now known as the Putney debates, where this document was debated by Oliver Cromwell, by representatives of the London Levellers who travelled down. Sir John Wildman then was one of them, with Colonel Thomas Rainsborough, the most senior New Model Army officer, to support the Levellers. And the debate between Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Ireton, and critically at this point, because Parliament has tried, this is the point where Parliament has tried to disband the army because it's a radical force, where the Presbyterians are trying to get a treaty with the king again. The army regiments start electing their own representatives. This is the first time in history that any army has ever just directly begun to elect its own representatives. They're known as agents, or sometimes as agitators, which meant the same thing in the 17th century, but that's where the word comes from. Agitator was the elected representative of the New Model Army regiments sent to debate the future of the country with Oliver Cromwell, Henry Ireton, and what they called the grandees, or the silken independence of the new Model Army. And they did it in the church. Began the first day of the debate in St Mary's Church in Putney, and if you go down to St Mary's Church in Putney, you can still see the exhibition about it, and you can see the words which Thomas Rainsborough, this is the Levellers' paper, by the way, misleadingly called the Moderate, because it certainly wasn't, but this is one of the first, well, it's the first political paper of an organisation in this country to disseminate their views. This is the artist, the contemporary artist, Red Saunders, has produced a series of what he calls living tableaus. And this is one of the English Revolution, where you can see the women Levellers, and there were a great deal of women petitioners and preachers in the Leveller movement, with the figures from the New Model Army. Now, purists object to this because they say, you wouldn't be sitting down to a meal wearing your cavalry helmet. But anyway, gives you some sense of the kind of atmosphere in the New Model Army at this time. This is Thomas Rainsborough, the guy I mentioned, and he said one of the most famous and indeed most beautiful pieces of revolutionary phraseology of the English Revolution in the Putney debates, debating with Ireton. He says, "For really I think that the poorest he that is in England hath a life to live as the greatest he, and therefore truly, sir, I think it is clear that every man that is to live under a government ought first by his own consent to put himself under that government. And I do not think that the poorest man in England is not at all bound in a strict sense to that government that he hath not had a voice to put himself under." And Ireton's response to this argument is very, very interesting, because Ireton, his sole defence against this fundamental democratic argument is, if you go down this route, you'll end up taking property away. It won't just be a question of the vote, you'll end up taking away all property. Now, we know that this isn't true. It doesn't, unfortunately, follow that if you have the vote, you actually level property, you get rid of property. But this was Ireton's fear, and he said, all the main thing that I speak for is because I would have an eye to property. I hope we do not contend for victory, but let every man consider with himself that he does not go that way to take away all property. And this is the crux of the matter in the Putney debate. It's unresolved. Really, it's unresolved then, unresolved now, whether or not democracy will challenge over property, or property will challenge over democracy. It is the unresolved question of what we call the bourgeois revolutions, or the democratic revolutions. Whether the democratic right is primary or the right to property is primary. And we are still, in that sense, dealing with the unfinished business of the English revolution. That's Rainsborough's signature from a document, from a letter about his time as one of the naval movers from a document in the Tanner manuscripts in the Bodleian Library, which astoundingly they just allow you to go and sort of pull around and take pictures of, which I did recently. Rainsborough was killed by a royalist raiding party in Doncaster when he was conducting a siege, one of the last sieges in England of the Second Civil War in 1648. This is a leaflet issued by the Leveller movement to his funeral. His funeral was a huge Leveller demonstration, assembled in Tottenham, marched down what's now the Kingston Road, through the city, heartland of the Leveller movement, past the Tower of London, where the cannons on the Tower of London were fired in salute, and out to St John's churchyard in Wapping, where the family came from, which was a base at Leveller, support seafaring village really at the time. Very interesting document, actually, this leaflet, given out in the streets in 1648, in memoriam Thomas Rainsborough, pro populo and Parlamento, for the people and Parliament. This bit of Latin means the brave leader of 1,000. Chiliarch was a Persian Greek term for a leader of 1,000 people. This is very interesting too. He made king, lords, commons, judges shake, cities and commons quake. He that fought naught but his country's good, and sealed their right with his own blood. Rainsborough, the just, the valiant, the true, here bids the noble Levellers adieu. Now that last line, bids the noble Levellers adieu, is interesting too, because the Leveller name has now been given to them. Some say it was given to them by Charles I, who certainly refers to them in that way, some by Cromwell and Arton in that debate. You can see how Arton would have gone for that appellation to call them Levellers. This is one of the times when they use it themselves. Often they use it in their pamphlets when they say a pamphlet by the Levellers unjustly so called. You know, they distance themselves from it because it's obviously a term being used by their political opponents. This is a time, and there are others, where they use it positively, where they've accepted that they are called Levellers and they're going to call themselves Levellers. Overton did this all the time, actually. So by this stage, they are an absolutely key force now. Not a large force, not majority force ever, but a key force in the revolution. And when it comes to the Presbyterians and the moderates, know that if they continue down this road, they're going to wreck the revolution and wreck themselves within the revolution. They suddenly, despite having been opponents of the Levellers at Putney and so forth, they turn to the Levellers and they realise that unless they form a revolutionary bloc on the left of the revolution, they'll become defeated by the right of the revolution. They form a bloc in late 1648, well, the middle of 1648, and this is what essentially forces through the revolution. Pride's purge, Colonel Thomas Pride goes in to Parliament with a troop of new model soldiers, kicks out the Conservative MPs. They move forward and execute the king in January 1649. This is the death warrant of Charles I, held in the House of Lords Library to this day. I think down here, this is Oliver Cromwell's signature, and over here somewhere, if I can find it, and somewhere in the middle here, is Henry Martin's signature, the Leveller MP. They were in such a state of hysteria when they got people to sign the document that they reached a point, Cromwell and Martin reached a point where they were literally hysterical. They were laughing as they did it and flicking ink at one another. And I think it's a hard thing to imagine, but you are doing something that nobody else in history has ever done. You know, all there has been up to this point is one long, endless line of kings, tsars, kaisers, Caesars of one description or another. They have been killed before by their rivals at court on the battlefield, but there has never been a moment where a king has been put on trial by his people, been found to be a traitor to his own country, and executed by law. That has never happened in history, and you can understand the kind of intensity of emotion, the kind of point that they've reached when they actually get to sign it. That's the execution, or a contemporary engraving of it. And the Levellers, it isn't true to say that they made this happen, but it is true to say that it is unlikely to have happened without them. In fact, Lilburne himself wasn't actually in favour of the it did actually empower Cromwell to be able to seize control of the fate of the revolution and not to implement the agreement of the people. That's some of the story. There's a lot more written. That is some of the story of the Levellers and English Revolution.
That was pretty fascinating. We're going to have questions now, so if you'd like to raise your hands, I'll take 2 or 3 at a time in different rounds. So,
yeah, I'm just interested in the thing about annual parliaments, because that comes up later with the Chartists. So I'm wondering what was particularly the purpose of annual parliaments as an idea.
On your slide 8, which was the agreement of the people, I saw in small letter the 5 commons of England. Can you say something about it? What was that?
yeah.
Yeah, in that slide.
What you mean here, the Commons of England?
Yes.
Can you take the last question?
Yeah.
Yeah, sometimes when people speak about the Levellers, you occasionally hear one of 2 different ways of speaking about it. I just wanted to know which one you agreed with more. Sometimes people refer to the Levellers as the first great revolutionary movement in England, and then other more pessimistic people refer to it as the last great revolutionary movement in England. I just wanted to know where you personally stood on that.
Okay. Well, on that, I suppose both would be would be a straightforward answer, really. The last successful, I suppose, would have to be and that's a tragedy, really, isn't it? I'll come back to that in a minute. The annual Parliament thing, it was, as it was with the Chartists, a matter of accountability. That the longer the Parliament sat, the more likely it was to no longer represent the people. And remember, they were living through what is called the Long Parliament, which assembled in November 1640, is purged in Pride's Purge in 1648, goes on to sit until Cromwell kicks out even more of them and creates the rump. So, you know, they'd won a parliament. They've won an effective parliament, but you can see why they might be a little concerned about the length of time that it was sitting without renewed elections. Just repeat for me your question about this.
The Commons of England, if you could say a few words, what was the Commons?
This is a reference to the Free Commons of England. I think if I can just read it, I think they're referring to actually to the House of Commons, as it was proposed by the agents of the 5 regiments for a general approbation by the army and for the continuance of the Free Commons of England. So they're talking about the House of Commons. Okay. So there's a shift in the language. If you look at the early petitions, they petitioned both houses. They petitioned the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Then they get to the point where they think, yay, House of Lords rubbish. In part of the whole conservative side of this, part of the semi-royalist, okay, the only elected bit here is the Commons, so all we're going to petition is the Commons. And there's outrage, by the way. This causes outrage on the right wing. These people they're just appealing to the Commons. This is completely unacceptable. Every petition since time immemorial has addressed both houses. Why are these people talking about the Commons of England assembled? You know, so this is a kind of there's a moment in the mid 1640s where that petitioning process begins to change. There's even more radical thing where they say, sod the lot of you, we're going to petition the New Model Army. The New Model Army is the real power in the land. Why are we petitioning the House of Commons or the House of Lords when actually it's going to be the army which decides things? So that's a very interesting, who is being petitioned and why is a very interesting question. But this one was directed, well, actually, as you say, as I say, it's interesting that this is both the army, for the general approbation of the army. Because what's happening in the New Model Army is, you know, early modern society doesn't have collectives, or it doesn't have very big collectives. It doesn't have big workforces. It doesn't have trade unions. It doesn't have civil society organisations at all. The predominant form of workplace in the City of London, where they were active, would have been masters with journeymen and apprenticeships living in the same house often. So it was that's where the whole sort of household economy comes from. Suddenly, there's this huge collective body, which is the army, and fuck me, it's begun electing people. You know, so you know, it's the first time that you get a revolutionary army with a very powerful democratic urge within it, which is beginning to settle the business of the country. So that's this agreement of people. It seems odd to us that you would say, why are they asking the army, the general approbation of the army? Well, they're asking the army because the army at this time is the biggest collective body in the country. It's the only body where there are actually free elections and very low class people are being elected as representatives. You know, and the royalists are absolutely sick of this. They absolutely hate it. They're always on about how, when they describe Rainsborough's funeral, they say, yes, his coffin was followed by Dick the door sweeper and Tom the tapster, and you know, they're outraged that the ordinary people are doing any of this kind of thing. But they were actually electing their own representatives, and as I say, this is where the word agitators comes from. They're electing their own agitators from the regiments. And Lilburn says when the agitators are looking a bit conservative at that point, he says, re-elect them, re-elect them. So 5 regiments then re-elect a whole new set of agitators. So that's why they're addressing the army, and the reason why they're addressing the commons is because this is the only thing that could be remotely described as having an element of democracy in it at the time.
Can we take another round of questions?
Yeah, it was just quickly on like the sort of role of history and the left today. I think a lot of people tend to look at history as almost like blueprints of what we can then extract and sort of almost implement word for word today, which is obviously like a wrong strategy. But I think obviously a way of looking at history is to show that indeed it's only ever been a bit of a problem of confidence, but a problem of the fact that history sets a powerful precedent that indeed it's only ever been people organised and democratically accountable to themselves that have ever changed anything. It's a sort of hypocrisy that people say, well, we can't change anything, but everything that we know to be sort of a freedom today has been sort of come about. I just wanted to know how you would personally see history and how we can learn from and use things like the levelers in our political strategies.
I know women don't feature much in levels, but if anyone would like to ask any questions, that would be very welcome. No?
Have you covered that topic?
No.
Go on.
Could you tell us about the role of women?
Yeah.
Especially the ones in pea green dresses.
Sea green.
Sea green dresses.
Okay, do you want to get that started?
Yeah. Well, the uses of history is a very complex question, I think. And it's never a neutral question. And with the levelers, it definitely isn't a neutral question. Everything that I've said about the levelers today is highly contested in a contemporary historical debate. Partly because, and this is why there's never a neutral moment with history. A lot of the sort of recovery of the 1940s, so in a kind of 50 or 60 year period, for some absolutely extraordinary reasons. First of all, a lot of what we know, indeed a lot of what we know about the English Revolution is due to a stationer, a bookseller, a man called George Thompson. And George Thompson was a bit of a geek because he collected, I think, three people maybe one of this. He collected and annotated practically every pamphlet, and there were thousands of them. There was, you know, when censorship broke down in the Long Parliament, there was a massive explosion of print, and that's what the levelers, that's how they managed to produce the petitions and the pamphlets and the moderate paper, and an army paper called Mercurius Militaris, or the Army Scout. That was a leveler paper produced by John Harris, a leveler printer. And Thomason collected them all. And he would note on them, and I think this is, he would note sometimes, you can see his handwriting here, and he would date them. And there are some that, where there's very interesting information, like there's one of the pamphlets, this is, which says, handed out by John Lilburn at Westminster. So this is how you know what Lilburn was up to. And Thomason collected, I can't remember what it is now, 10,000, 20,000 of them, and they're in the Thomason collection in the British Library, so you can still see them. They weren't really catalogued. They were there, but they weren't catalogued. And as you can imagine, if you're a historian, what do you do with 20,000 pounds? How do you know what they were? So the business of cataloguing them didn't happen until the sort of late Victorian period. That's one thing that happened. The other thing is the Putney debates, those things that I read from Thomas Rainsborough. How do we know about them? Well, we know about them because a man called William Clark, who was a clerk, a note-taker to the Army Council, he sat in the Putney debates, writing them down. And he wrote them down in shorthand. Shorthand appears in this period because, when I was saying about the preachers, if you're a Puritan, it's very important that you listen to the preacher, that you think about what he says, you study what he says. So it's not like Catholic Mass, it's not like the Catholic Church where you just sort of receive the message. You study. And to study, you take notes. And to take notes verbatim, you need shorthand. So shorthand is invented in the gathered churches at this time, and Clark has shorthand. Notes it all down, transcribes some of it into longhand, and then gets a bit nervous in the Restoration. Then the whole notes go to his brother, and his brother sticks them in Worcester College, Oxford, and they sit there from about 1670 to about 1890, when a historian called C.H. Firth, Charles Firth, discovers them and starts producing the Clark papers. So suddenly, in the late 1890s, we have a catalogue, and we have the Putney debates, and then it just rushes off there. And we start looking at the pamphlets. Some American historians, Haller and Davis, and so we'll start printing the Leveller tracts, and then the whole thing gets going. There's Communist Party historians group, A.L. Morton and so forth begin studying them. Christopher Hill comes on the back of this, and suddenly, so you know, the history of what we know is discontinuous and connected to both discovery and to radicals in the 20th century beginning to study it and get it out there. There's been enormous reaction to that about the time that not coincidentally, about the time that Margaret Thatcher was elected in this country and Ronald Reagan in the States, and the revisionist school of historians have done an enormous amount to try and destroy. They say the Levers weren't really a party; they were just part of the independents. They weren't very influential. They weren't very big. They didn't really have an influence in the army. And if you read Marcus Lansky's book or Claire Worden's writings, or J.C.D. Clark, there's an attempt to push the Levellers into the margins of it. So this is contested, and it's not so much about directly what we can learn, although there are interesting things to say, and I'll say one thing about that in a minute, but it's about holding on to the idea that a group of organised radicals, no matter how different from us, did play an important role in the development. Not the determining role, not the major role always, but an important role in these events as they happen. Because if they couldn't do that, why could we do it now? If they could do that, perhaps we can do it now. That's the kind of general connection exists, and that's why it's important to recover this and not allow it to be buried. You know, Walter Benjamin, the Marxist critic, has a brilliant thing where he says that if the forces of reaction triumph, even the dead will not be safe. And what he means by that is, you know, that if the forces of reaction triumph now, they will cover over, they will bury the dead. Literally, they'll bury the traditions of the radical traditions of the past, and that's why it's important to recover them. On the women, I did say, where have they gone? Where have the women gone? You see in Red's thing, there are a lot of, see this woman preaching, and the women gathered here. And this was a literally patriarchal society. I mean, people talk about patriarchy now, but I mean, in terms of literally the male head of the family dominating, that's how the productive unit, the master, the journeyman, the apprentices who lived in his house and produced in his house as children, you know, as almost as the status of children, with the wife in a subordinate role, the literally hierarchical patriarchal structure. Not, I mean, you know, patriarchy is a general synonym for male dominance now, or sexism, but then it had a quite literal meaning. Now, for women to be preaching is absolutely astounding. And again, the royalists and the right wing go absolutely bonkers about this. There's a woman called Mrs. Attaway, who's a lace seller in Cheapside, and she starts preaching. And the pamphlets going, what, you know, the sectarians, as they call them, the sectarian churches, the independents, they've got women preaching. How bad is this? And one of the Leveller leaders, the treasurer of the Leveller Club, a collected Jews, a man called Samuel Chidley or Chidley, I don't know if anybody knows how to pronounce, but his mother, Catherine Chidley, was a Puritan preacher who wrote pamphlets, absolutely astounding. Early on, 1640, Larner, the Leveller printer, was printing pamphlets by Catherine Chidley defending separatist churches. The wives of the Leveller leaders are an absolutely astounding group of people. Elizabeth Lilburne, John Lilburn's partner, is a heroic woman. Partly she's a heroic woman for just being, I think, married to John Lilburne, probably kind of effort in itself. But for instance, Lilburne is captured. He's in the army. He fights at the Battle of Brentford, Turnham Green, on the outskirts, when the Royalists in the early parts of the war tried to invade. He's captured, taken prisoner to the King's headquarters in Oxford, and the Royalists say, we're going to execute all the parliamentary prisoners. We're just going to shoot them. We're just going to kill a lot of them. And Elizabeth Lilburne goes to the Commons and says, you've got to do something about this. And the Commons then pass a vote saying, if any of the prisoners held by the Royalists at Oxford are killed, we will kill all the Royalist prisoners that we have. And that stops it dead. The Royalists at Oxford say, okay, this isn't going to happen. Elizabeth Lilburne has to get, you know, there's the account phone, so you have to get the news that the Commons have made this vote. You have to get it to Oxford before John Lilburne's killed. She's pregnant, she gets on a horse, and she rides to Oxford to stop it happening and to force Lilburne's release. She was a massive petitioner in her own right. When Lilburne was imprisoned in the Tower, she organised a demonstration of women. There were constant demonstrations of women outside the House of Commons, many of them organised by the Levellers. And there's a brilliant account in one of the pamphlets where some of the MPs come out and they say that this is after they've executed the king since 1649. They say this is absolutely, you know, this is very unusual. This is very unusual that women should petition. And the women say to them, well, it's very unusual that you cut off the king's head, but no doubt you'll justify it. And the Leveller colour became sea green. That's why it's on the ribbons, because well, the story is that it was the colour of Rainsborough's regimental flag, and at his funeral they tore up the flag and wore the sea green ribbon, and the sea green ribbon then became the colour of the Levellers. And it became, at the height of the revolution, it became very fashionable. So women had whole dresses made out of sea green silk, and they became known as the bonny besses, which, if you think about it, Lilburne was a Geordie, so I think that's where it comes from. The bonny besses in the sea green dresses. This is in the pamphlets, and the lusty lasses of the levelling party. This is all the language that's used at the time. So it was an enormous, apart from everything else, it was an enormous eruption of women into political life in a completely unprecedented way.
Brilliant. We'll have one more round of questions.
Just came to ask that question.
Yes. But just before we go to the last round of questions, just to let you know, now after this in here is what do Marxists say about feminism with Kate Connolly, and then next door is Rebel Cities, from the right of us into the urban revolution, and debating permanent revolution. Also, if you enjoyed Rees's rhetoric, he's doing another talk later on, not the next session, but the session afterwards, from 2 till 3:15 on strategy and tactics and how the left should organise to change the world. So, implementing what we discussed in contemporary projects. So, are there any more questions before we wrap up?
Actually, I've got a question. I thought it was very interesting what this gentleman said about whether that was the last or the first, English Revolution, and perhaps why we have out of information that things can't be covered up anymore, etc., etc. So that's my one question. Are we right for another revolution? What form do you think it would take? Because I tried to work that out myself. How would a modern day revolution? What form would it take now?
Question of the age. Need an army.
And exactly, do we need an army?
I've got a related question. I'm just reading something, it's brought something that reminded me. Is this an example? So, I was reading something by Julian Assange, just about politicised societies and not living in a politicised society. Therefore, what you say doesn't really matter that much because it means it's not going to affect so directly whether or not someone owns some land or some property. So this is an example of the type of revolution happening here is happening in Parliament, right? In the actual structures that do exist, rather than as a whole sort of bunch of people outside in a sort of highly politicised society, maybe where you have to go against your dictator, and in a sort of Arab Springs type style, it's a different type of thing. So I don't know. What do you feel about that?
I got one as well. The Putney debates, what were the breaks on it then? How come they didn't get any further with the Putney debates? Bang, it just stopped and there was no more debate,
Any last questions, or okay, should we go back in that?
Yeah. Well, the end of the Putney debate is a very interesting question because they're debating this for several days, and at the end, of course, there's a deadlock. Rainsborough and Wildman are arguing one side, Ireton's arguing the other, and they're actually incompatible. There's some historians who argue that they're actually searching for a compromise, I suppose, in many ways. Even in a debate, you are. But they couldn't resolve it. And in the end, and this is a lesson in the exercise of political power in any age, really. First of all, Cromwell does what any embattled authority does when they're challenged in an open auditorium. He moves to a committee. He says, "Oh no, we will form a committee." So that's always, I always think when you hear that, there's a moment of alarm, should say. But they agree. This is disputed between parties, but they agree that this will be resolved by a rendezvous of the entire army to decide whether or not it accepts the agreement of the people. Lilburne and his supporters, Rainsborough, then say Cromwell deceived us because we agreed at Putney that there would be a rendezvous of the whole army, and Cromwell and Fairfax decide to split the army up and have 3 separate rendezvous. Now you can understand why, from their point of view, you divide and rule. Move to a committee, divide and rule. These are age-old stalling tactics. The first of these is at Ware, at Courtbush Field in Ware. And the Levellers, Lilburne goes out there, he's in a pub down the road, he's not in the army at this point, he's in a pub down the road. The Leveller influenced regiments turn up, they're not supposed to be at this rendezvous, they're supposed to be at some other one, but they think, okay, they're trying to separate us, we're going to march, and they get rid of their officers and they march to the Ware rendezvous, and they have the agreement of the people stuck in their hats. And what happens is, Cromwell and the officers ride into the regiments, pull the agreement of the people out their hats, take 3 of the leaders of it, execute one of them. Actually what they do is they take 3 of them, they force them to draw lots, and the 2 that aren't going to be shot are forced to shoot Richard Arnold, the one who is being shot. And that's how Putney's decided. That's the end. And you can see therefore what a big thing it is for them to join forces again a year later in order to get to the king, in order to execute the king, because there's been this huge breach after Putney, it's sealed in blood. So that's how that ends. On the question of inside the structure and outside the structure, this is one way in which the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the American Revolution are different from modern revolutions. You see, this isn't a movement of the very poorest people, of the majority of the society against the elderly class. This is relatively well-off merchants who are beginning to trade in a capitalist way, saying that the old feudal kingship doesn't work for us, we need a parliamentary republic. So it's a movement of a broader section of the population, but not a majority and not the poorest, against the existing elite. Modern revolutions are revolutions of the majority of the population against the elite, and they typically raise the question of whether or not there will be a transformation both in democracy and in property ownership. This revolution was about saying a different form of property ownership, our kind manufacturing, capitalist farming method of property ownership should supersede the old aristocratic medieval form. So a different revolution, different kind of revolution. Marx said in the manifesto that all previous movements have been movements of minorities or in the interests of minorities, and that's still true of the English Revolution. So a modern revolution, like the Arab Spring, has a different character because this is the mass of the very poorest sections of the population. This is, the railway workers striking 2 weeks ago, the insurrection in Port Said 2 months ago. This is after the initial, the Egyptian revolution is following the classic pattern of differentiation within the revolutionary camp as it progresses. At the beginning, against Mubarak, the Muslim Brotherhood were part of the revolutionary movement, fought into Tahrir Square. Now they're in government, there's a radical section opposing them. It's differentiating on exactly the pattern that you'd expect it to do, but with different accumulations of social forces. I don't think you ever know, to answer. The English revolutionaries didn't know, and neither did the Egyptian revolutionaries know what the form of the revolution would be. If you'd asked, I knew that, I was in Tahrir Square, I'd known many of the Egyptian revolutionaries for 10 years, I've worked with them. If you'd asked them 2 months beforehand, do you think it will be mass assemblies in Tahrir Square? It's pretty weird, why would it be that? Why would it be strike action or something? It always takes, and in a way, especially takes revolutionaries by surprise. Why especially? Because revolutionaries study previous revolutions, so they know what happened in the past. And you tend to expect that the present will reproduce the patterns of the past, which it does in part, but only in part. And there are always new things. Did anybody say that the internet and the mobile phone will be key to the Egyptian revolution? Well, some people had an inkling, but not on that scale, not in that way. And I think these are interesting questions because just as the free printing press, the underground press, pamphlet production was the use of it in freedom was entirely new. It was although the printing press had existed for 160 years, using like this was new technology in the 1640s. And I think there's an interesting interaction between a new revolutionary movement and a new mass communication technology at that moment, which is very interesting if you think about what we're talking about with the internet and websites and so forth. Now that's an interesting parallel, but I don't think you'll know the format of the revolution. I agree that you have a sense in this society that it's unravelling in the way that Charles I's monarchy was unravelling. That there's a very wide discontent, there's a what's called the democratic deficit, a breach between the entire, not just this party or that party, but between the entire ruling elite, a very deep suspicion of the corporate rulers. In this country, if you look at the opinion polls, 7.5 million people now define themselves, self-define, as on the left or the far left, and that's doubled in a decade. And at the same time, the old traditional methods of trade union organisation are still important, but they're weaker than they were. So you've got an accumulation of a high level of discontent, a breach between very large sectors of the population and the governing class, some new forms of communication. How they will gel, I don't know. And I don't think anybody, if anybody's honest, nobody knows. What you do is, where the changes start taking place, where the struggles are, you locate yourself there in the hope that you can influence, bring together, make the most of the opposition in the way that the Levellers did. And one of the reasons of looking at the Levellers is because there you see a group of people at the heart of a much broader revolution movement to begin with, who as time goes by, they make use of the ideological, practical ways of organising that they've learned. They take up the idea of the Norman yoke, that we've been under the oppression of the ruling classes since the Norman yoke. They take up the religious ideas of democracy in the church and apply it to democracy in the state. They begin to assemble a new ideology out of old bricks, and they create something which is rooted in their past and what they understand, but then becomes entirely new. And I think if we think about a revolutionary process like this, and in this kind of way, then acting in our society now becomes more understandable, more conscious, a more effective thing.
Thanks, that was a great answer.